For centuries, one story has shaped how the world sees Africa. A story repeated so often that millions accepted it as fact. A story that says Africa had no history, no great civilizations, no written records, no role in the Bible. A story that erased kingdoms, overlooked libraries, ignored civilizations, and changed how an entire continent was remembered. But what if that story begins to fall apart the moment you compare it with the evidence? What if Africa wasn't hidden from the world, but deeply connected to it? What if the historical record tells a completely different story? In this documentary, we'll uncover forgotten kingdoms, lost manuscripts, biblical connections, and the evidence behind 10 of the most common myths about Africa. Some may surprise you, others may completely change the way you see history. Before we begin, let me ask you a question. How many of the things you've heard about Africa are actually based on historical evidence, and how many have simply been repeated for generations? The answer may surprise you, because some of the most common beliefs about Africa didn't become popular because they were proven true. They became popular because they were repeated. For hundreds of years, the story of Africa has been told through explorers, colonial officials, missionaries, travelers, textbooks, films, and popular culture. Many of those sources contain valuable history, but they also reflect the perspectives of the people who wrote them. Over time, certain ideas were accepted without much question, and once an idea is repeated often enough, it can begin to sound like fact. But that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. History doesn't stand still. Archaeologists continue to uncover ancient cities. Historians continue to translate forgotten manuscripts. New discoveries continue to challenge old assumptions, and piece by piece, a more complete picture of Africa's past is emerging. Now, that doesn't mean every popular belief is false, and it doesn't mean every new claim is correct. That's why in this countdown, we're not relying on rumors, social media posts, or modern myths. We're going back to historical records, archaeological discoveries, and the work of historians to examine what the evidence actually shows. Some of these myths may already sound familiar. Others may completely change the way you see Africa's place in world history. But here's the surprising part. Many of these 10 lies are connected. Together, they tell a much bigger story. So as we count down from 10 to 1, pay attention to how each myth builds on the last, because by the time we reach number 1, you'll see why these ideas lasted for so long and why the historical record tells a very different story. One quick question before we begin. What country are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We always enjoy seeing people from all over the world exploring history together. Now, let's begin with number 10. Imagine believing an entire continent was cut off from civilization. For years, that's exactly what many people were taught, that Africa developed alone, that the rest of the world barely knew it existed until European explorers arrived. It sounds believable until you look at the evidence, and the evidence tells a very different story. Because centuries before Portugal sent ships around Africa's coast, African merchants were already trading across the Sahara Desert, across the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean. Gold from West Africa reached North Africa and beyond. Ivory moved east. Spices, textiles, and ideas flowed in both directions. Along Africa's eastern coast, ports like Kilwa and Mombasa welcomed merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists have even uncovered Chinese porcelain buried beneath these ancient trading cities. Now ask yourself, how does that happen on an isolated continent? Think about that for a moment. If Africa was isolated, how did Chinese pottery end up there? It wasn't an accident, it was trade. And that's only the beginning. Trade brings more than goods. It brings religions, languages, ideas. Christianity reached Egypt in the 1st century. Islam spread through merchants, creating some of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. So where did the myth come from? Partly because many history books began the story when Europeans arrived. Everything that happened before was often pushed into the background. But history didn't begin with European exploration. Africa wasn't waiting to join the world, it was already helping shape it. And if Africa was connected to the world, then who was writing its story? If this first myth has already challenged something you thought you knew, take a second to like this video. It helps more people discover documentaries like this. And if you enjoy exploring history through evidence rather than assumptions, subscribe to the Heritage Map. We're just getting started. Now, let's answer the next question. Who was writing Africa's story? If Africa was connected to the world, then here's the obvious question. Who was writing its story? For many people, the answer is simple. No one. You've probably heard the claim before, that Africa had no writing, that its history survived only through spoken stories. It's one of the most common beliefs about the continent. But there's a problem. The historical record paints a much more complex picture. Yes, oral history was incredibly important across Africa. Skilled storytellers preserved history, family lineages, laws, and traditions for generations. But oral history was never the whole story. Long before many parts of Europe began keeping written records, Africans were already writing in several different scripts. Ancient Egyptians developed one of the world's earliest writing systems. Farther south, the Kingdom of Kush used the Meroitic script. In Ethiopia, Ge'ez became the language of kings, churches, and literature. Across West Africa, scholars wrote in Arabic and in African languages using a writing tradition known as Ajami. But perhaps the greatest surprise is Timbuktu, and this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Imagine opening a wooden chest that's been sealed for generations and finding handwritten books hundreds of years old. Not dozens, thousands. Books on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, law, poetry, history. Not exactly what most people expect to find in medieval Africa. Some survived wars, others survived attempts to destroy them. Many are still being studied today. So why were so many people taught that Africa had no written history? Because much of Africa's written record remained outside the textbooks that shaped how generations learned world history. Some manuscripts stayed in private family collections. Others were written in languages unfamiliar to Western scholars. As historians continue translating and studying these texts, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Africa's history wasn't unwritten. Much of it was simply overlooked. And once you realize Africans were recording their own history, another familiar claim starts to fall apart. How could Europe have discovered a continent that was already documenting itself? One word. That's all it takes to change the way people see an entire continent. Discovered. It's a word that appears in textbooks, documentaries, and everyday conversations. But stop and think about it for a moment, because one simple question changes everything. How do you discover a continent where millions of people are already living? By the time Portuguese sailors reached parts of Africa's coastline in the 15th century, they weren't sailing into an empty land. They encountered kingdoms, not wilderness, civilizations, governments,
Markets, trade networks, diplomats, and rulers who had governed their people for generations.
The Kingdom of Congo was already established. Benin was flourishing. Ethiopia had been a Christian kingdom for centuries. Across the continent, millions of people were living lives that had nothing to do with whether Europe had arrived yet. So why did the word discovered become so common? Because from a European perspective, these voyages revealed places that were new to Europe. But that's very different from saying they were new to the world. Imagine visiting a city for the first time and announcing that you discovered it. It would sound ridiculous. The city already existed. Its people already knew where they were. Its history was already unfolding. The same is true for Africa. European exploration changed global history. It expanded trade. It transformed maps. It eventually led to colonization. But exploration is not the same as discovery. Africa didn't suddenly enter history because Europeans reached its shores. History was already unfolding, with or without Europe. It had been shaping history long before that. And if that's true, there's another question we have to ask. Why do so many people think Africa barely appears in one of the most influential books ever written? Let's do a quick test. When you picture the Bible, what places come to mind? Jerusalem? Bethlehem? Nazareth? Maybe Rome? For many people, that's where the story seems to happen. But open the Bible itself, you might be surprised by what appears next. And another region appears again and again and again. Africa. And once you notice it, it's difficult to unsee. Egypt alone is mentioned hundreds of times. It was where Joseph became one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. It was where the Israelites lived before the Exodus. And when King Herod sought to kill the infant Jesus, it was Egypt that became a place of refuge for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. The Bible also speaks of Cush, a powerful kingdom south of Egypt, often associated with parts of modern-day Sudan. In the New Testament, we meet the Ethiopian eunuch, one of the earliest recorded African converts to Christianity, and Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried Jesus' cross, came from North Africa. The story doesn't end there. By the 4th century, Christianity had taken deep root in Egypt and Ethiopia, centuries before it became firmly established across much of Northern Europe. So why do many people assume Africa had almost no place in the biblical story? Part of the answer lies in the images many of us grew up seeing: paintings, films, illustrations. They often focus on the Levant and later European Christianity, leaving Africa's presence easy to overlook. But when you read the text itself, a different picture emerges. Africa isn't standing at the edge of the biblical story, it's woven into it from beginning to end. Now I'm curious, how many of those African places or people in the Bible did you already know before watching this? Let me know in the comments. And once you see that, an even bigger myth becomes impossible to ignore. If Africa was connected to the world, preserving knowledge, and deeply woven into history itself, how did so many people come to believe it had no great civilizations? Ask someone where ancient Egypt was. Most people will answer correctly: Africa. But ask a different question: was ancient Egypt an African civilization? Suddenly, the answers become much more divided. How did that happen? How did one of the world's most famous civilizations become separated from the very continent where it was born? The answer isn't geography, it's history. Ancient Egypt developed along the Nile River in northeastern Africa. That's not debated. It's where the pyramids were built. It's where the pharaohs ruled. It's where one of history's greatest civilizations rose to power. But Egypt was never isolated. For thousands of years, it traded with kingdoms to the south, exchanged ideas with the Near East, and interacted with societies across the Mediterranean. Like every long-lasting civilization, Egypt changed over time.
Different dynasties ruled, people migrated, new cultures arrived, old ones blended together. That's why historians don't describe ancient Egyptians using today's racial categories. Those ideas belong to the modern world, not the ancient one. What historians do agree on is much simpler. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization that was deeply connected to neighboring regions. So why is that often forgotten? Because for generations, people argued more about who could claim Egypt than what Egypt actually was. And when that happens, history gets replaced by identity politics. But Egypt wasn't the only great civilization Africa produced. In fact, by the time Europeans began carving up the continent, many powerful African states had already existed for centuries. So where did the idea come that Europe had to civilize Africa? It might be one of the most influential ideas ever attached to Africa, that Europe arrived and brought civilization with it. But let's test that claim. Can you civilize people who already have kingdoms, who already have laws, who already have universities, who trade with the outside world? Long before the colonial era, Africa was home to powerful states with their own systems of government. The Mali Empire controlled vast trade networks across West Africa. Great Zimbabwe built monumental stone cities without mortar, structures that still stand today. And it wasn't the only one. The Kingdom of Benin became famous for bronze artworks so detailed that early Europeans struggled to believe they had been made in Africa. Ethiopia remained an independent Christian kingdom for centuries while many European kingdoms were still taking shape. None of this means colonialism had no impact. It introduced new technologies, railways, and administrative systems in many places. But it also brought conquest, forced labor, economic extraction, and borders that often ignored existing societies. History isn't one-sided. Neither achievement nor suffering should erase the other. The problem is the phrase, "Europe civilized Africa." It assumes civilization wasn't already there. The historical record points in the different direction. Europe encountered civilizations. It did not create them. And once that myth begins to fall, another one quickly comes with it. Because if Africa had wealthy kingdoms, thriving trade, and advanced societies, why do so many people believe it has always been poor? When many people think of Africa today, the first image that comes to mind is poverty. But here's a question. Has Africa always been poor? Or has history made it seem that way? To answer that, we have to travel back several centuries. For centuries, Africa was known across the world for something very different: its wealth. West Africa supplied enormous amounts of gold to international trade. Merchants crossed the Sahara searching for gold, salt, ivory, and other valuable goods. Then came a ruler whose wealth became legendary: Mansa Musa. How does the richest ruler of his age come from a continent people call permanently poor? During his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, historical sources describe him giving away so much gold that its value fell in parts of Egypt for a time. Whether every detail of those accounts is exact is debated. What isn't debated is this: the Mali Empire was one of the richest states of its age. Across the continent, African kingdoms traded with Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Goods moved across deserts, across rivers, across oceans. So what changed? There isn't one simple answer. Over centuries, the Atlantic slave trade removed millions of people. Colonial rule often reorganized economies around exporting raw materials instead of building local industries. After independence, different countries faced different combinations of political instability, conflict, corruption, debt, and global economic pressures. That's why Africa cannot be explained with a single story. It's a continent of 54 countries, each with its own history. Some have experienced rapid economic growth. Others continue to face enormous challenges. The point is this: poverty is not Africa's permanent identity. History is far more complicated than that. And perhaps no subject has been simplified more than the next one. It's a story repeated in classrooms, on television, and across social media. Africans sold their own people. But is that really the whole story? We've reached one of the most controversial claims in African history. You've probably heard it before. Africans sold their own people. For many people, that's where the conversation ends. But should it? Let's start with what historians broadly agree on. Yes, some African rulers and merchants participated in the slave trade. That happened. Ignoring it would only replace one myth with another. But here's the question almost nobody asks. Could the largest forced migration in human history really be explained by one sentence? It couldn't. The reality is far more complicated. The Atlantic slave trade became possible because millions of people across several continents became part of the system.
European merchants financed voyages. Shipbuilders built the vessels. Governments granted trading rights. Plantation owners in the Americas created an enormous demand for enslaved labor. African intermediaries in some regions captured, traded, or sold captives. Each played a different role. Without the demand, the trade could never have reached the scale that it did. And without local conflicts and participation in some regions, many captives would never have reached the coast. History requires us to hold both truths at the same time. It wasn't one continent acting alone. It was an international system driven by profit. And while some African leaders took part, millions of Africans were the ones who suffered. Families were torn apart, communities were emptied, kingdoms were destabilized, entire regions were changed forever. So why does the simpler version survive? Because simple stories are easier to repeat than complicated ones. But simple stories are not always accurate. And once you begin questioning simple explanations, you begin noticing something else. Almost every myth we've explored has one thing in common. It asks you to forget what Africa had already achieved, which leads to perhaps the biggest myth of all, the idea that Africa has no history. Let's imagine something for a moment. Imagine opening a world history textbook and discovering that almost everything about Europe before the last 500 years had been removed. No ancient Greece, no Roman Empire, no Renaissance, no Vikings, no castles, no philosophers. Now, imagine someone looking at those missing pages and saying, Europe has no history. You'd immediately recognize the problem, not because Europe suddenly gained a history, but because the story being told was incomplete. The same thing has happened to Africa. For generations, many people were introduced to African history at the point where Europeans arrived. Everything before that was reduced, compressed, or skipped altogether. But history doesn't begin when someone else starts writing about you. Long before colonialism, Africa was already home to kingdoms, empires, scholars, engineers, merchants, farmers, artists, and builders, far more than most people were ever taught. Ancient Egypt, Kush, Aksum, Mali, Songhai, Kanem Bornu, Benin, Great Zimbabwe, and hundreds of other societies, each with its own story. Some rose to power, some declined, some disappeared, just like civilizations everywhere else. That's what history looks like. Not one uninterrupted success story, not one uninterrupted tragedy, but thousands of years of human experience. So perhaps the real question isn't, does Africa have history? The evidence answered that long ago. The better question is, why were so many people taught otherwise? Because once you remove a people's past, it's much easier to underestimate their place in the world. If you erase someone's history, what else becomes easier to erase? And that's exactly where our final myth begins. If you've watched this far, you've probably noticed something. None of these 10 myths stand alone.
They're connected. If people believe Africa was isolated, then it's easier to believe it had no written history. If they believe it had no written history, it's easier to believe it had no great civilizations. And if they believe it had no civilizations, it's easier to believe Africa contributed nothing to the world. One myth supports the next. Each one makes the next seem more believable until an entire continent begins to disappear. But now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Look at the evidence we've uncovered. Africa traded across continents. It preserved written knowledge. It appears throughout the biblical record. It produced some of history's most influential kingdoms and civilizations. So here's the final question. How could a continent that did all that contribute nothing to world civilization? It couldn't. The evidence points in the opposite direction. African gold fueled international trade. African scholars preserved and expanded knowledge. Ancient Egyptian achievements influenced architecture, engineering, and statecraft for generations. African Christian communities in Egypt and Ethiopia became some of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in history. African music, languages, art, and culture continue to shape the modern world. And according to the overwhelming scientific evidence available today, the story of our own species begins in Africa. That doesn't mean every African kingdom was prosperous. It doesn't mean Africa's past was free from war, slavery, or injustice. No continent can make that claim. The goal of this documentary was never to replace one story with another. It was to compare familiar claims with the historical evidence.
And after examining each one, a pattern begins to emerge. Africa wasn't isolated. It wasn't without writing. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't missing from the biblical story. It wasn't without civilizations. It wasn't always poor. One by one, the myths begin to fall away. And what remains isn't a new history. It's the one that was there all along. History doesn't become more truthful by making one civilization greater than another. It becomes more truthful when every civilization is given its proper place. And that's exactly where Africa belongs. At the beginning of this documentary, I asked one simple question. How much of what we've been told about Africa is actually true? By now, you know the answer. 10 claims. 10 stories that millions of people have heard about Africa. Some you've probably believed yourself. By now, you've seen something important. None of these myths stand alone. They build on each other. That's how myths survive, not because they are supported by the strongest evidence, but because they are repeated often enough to stop being questioned. History deserves better than that, because when history loses its complexity, everyone loses something, and so do we. The goal of this documentary was never to prove that Africa was perfect. No civilization is. Africa's history includes triumphs and failures, periods of peace and periods of war, innovations and injustice, just like every other part of the world. The goal was much simpler: to compare popular claims with the historical evidence.
And when we did, a different picture emerged of ancient kingdoms, global trade, written records, biblical connections, great civilizations, and contributions that reached far beyond the continent. Maybe the biggest lie wasn't any single claim on this list. Maybe it was something much bigger. Maybe it was the idea that Africa's story could be reduced to just one story at all. Because it can't. It's a continent of extraordinary diversity, stretching across thousands of years, thousands of cultures, and billions of human experiences. And the more we learn, the more complete the story becomes. Before you go, I have one final question. Which of these 10 myths did you honestly believe before watching this documentary? No judgment. We've all been taught things that deserve a second look. I'm genuinely curious, so let me know in the comments. And if there's another common belief about Africa you'd like us to investigate, tell me below. It might become our next documentary. If you enjoyed this video and want more documentaries that separate historical myth from historical evidence, consider subscribing to the Heritage Map. Because history isn't just about remembering the past, it's about understanding it. And sometimes, all it takes is one question to change the way we see the world. History has so many stories we've never been told. Africa is only the beginning. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next documentary.